Merhabalar, alandayız, sınırsızdayız ve bugün Küba'yı konuşacağız. We are joined today by Helen Yaffe, Professor of Latin American Political Economy at the University of Glasgow. Your research explores Cuban development, economic history of Cuba, socialist political economy, and Latin American development and regionalism. Beyond your numerous academic contributions, you are the author of the book We Are Cuba: How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, a world you've witnessed firsthand, experienced firsthand through times of living and researching, years of living and researching on the island. Professor Yaffe, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation to join you today.
Thank you for accepting it. As we speak, Cuba and the Cuban people are facing intensified imperialist aggression from the United States. The 66-year-long US blockade of Cuba reached a new level when Donald Trump imposed a total oil blockade, cutting oil shipments from Venezuela after the US attacked the country and kidnapped its president, Nicolás Maduro, while also threatening other countries with tariffs if they supply oil to Cuba. This has grave humanitarian consequences, which we will discuss. It is the latest stage in the 66-year-long US blockade. And 66 years ago, hunger and desperation were keys to the overthrow of the government. That is, the official Mallory Memo of 1960, seeking the fall of socialism on the island. How does it interact with the Donroe Doctrine today?
Oh, I think that we have to be clear that the secret memorandum, which you cited, which was written by Lester Mallory, he was the assistant special something or other, in charge of sort of his job was to devise a Cuba policy. This was the year after the revolutionary state seized power, and they were looking at Cuba. They, CIA operations had started in sometime in autumn 1959, so they were already underway. And they were clear that they didn't want Fidel Castro, the revolutionary government, in power. But this was before the the sort of embrace of Cuba or alignment of Cuba with the Soviet Union. This was before the larger nationalizations and so on. And that's important to say because when we look at US policy, it hasn't changed, it's entrenched, or the form has changed, but the objective has remained the same. And the excuse has, the pretext may have changed. So it may be, that they're communist or that the nationalizations and we want compensation. But actually, this was in April 1960. And they recognise, Lester Mallory's memorandum recognises that Fidel Castro and the revolutionary government have popular support. And that the only way that they would be able to change that would be by using economic warfare. And the purpose of this is, it's political. It's to create, as you say, the words of Lester Mallory, hunger, desperation, in order to, and this is the first track is economic warfare, and the second track is fostering internal opposition so that you have, an uprising against the government. And that has really not changed. What we're seeing now, so you asked me about the Donroe Doctrine, which is, of course, this ludicrous name that Trump himself has given to his renewed aggressive sort of imperialist aggression over the Americas. And, essentially it's an assertion of US power. Now, this kind of military aggression, overt aggression becomes necessary when hegemony through influence, persuasion, seduction is no longer possible. So we need to understand that this moment of offensive by US imperialism reflects its own deep economic, political, and social crisis domestically, but also its losing its dominance worldwide. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that the United States, what it spends on its military is more than the next 10 top spending countries on their militaries, right? And this is what it is now resorting to the threat of violence, and indeed now, as you referred to the action in Venezuela, which led to the death of 100 people, including 32 Cubans, to direct violence. So, it's interesting because this is the Monroe Doctrine, where the name comes from, was about US control over the Western Hemisphere. But, what we're seeing now with some of the imperialist aggression under Trump and his administration is actually reaching beyond the Western Hemisphere. So a few days ago, there was another kidnapping of a ship, an oil tanker, which was maybe apparently en route to Cuba, but it was in the Indian Ocean. So, this is like well beyond the initial kind of objective set out by the Monroe Doctrine, which is a totally, imperialistic kind of policy, right? To say which is our part of the world where we can control for the purpose of exploiting in our interests and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's clearly an extension of that, but it's taken a very aggressive form because the US itself is losing its dominance.
And that decades-long blockade had and still has serious consequences on the Cuban people, on the island. And with the latest stage, with the total oil blockade, it's even graver now. And how does the latest stage of US blockade on Cuba reshape the impact of the blockade on Cuba and the Cuban people?
I mean, it's a siege. It's a complete siege. It's like a medieval, blockade. So for many years, people knew the blockade was existing, and many, people like to argue that it wasn't in fact a blockade, it was an embargo, it was a bilateral issue. And one of the things that I've done with my work and, through academia and also the solidarity work is to demonstrate that actually this was false. The blockade does affect and obstruct Cuba's interaction with the whole world. So already before these measures, since Trump in 2021 put Cuba back on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which is a complete ridiculous notion that Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism. Even the officials from the State Department have shown that this is rubbish. But since then, I'm a British citizen. I have a British bank account. But if I try to send money to you in a Turkish bank account, or let's say a European bank account, and I transfer, any amount of money, I don't send it to Cuba. I don't transfer my money into US dollars. I send it from a UK bank into a European bank. It will still be blocked if anywhere in the transaction, in the reference or the address or something, the word Cuba appears, right? So this is how extensive the blockade has become. Now, for many years, people didn't really understand how suffocating it was because the Cubans became really expert at finding what they call workarounds and navigating the blockade, very creative solutions. And if you look at the sanctions against Iraq in the 1990s, it was well recorded. UNICEF said, 150 children were dying every day as a direct result of these sanctions. And people would look at Cuba and say, well, we don't see that kind of human suffering. And that's because they have a socialist government, right? So they, protected the population. They cushioned the population from the brutality of the US blockade. And they also used the central planning system to make sure that there was a fair distribution of the resources, shrinking resources that were there. However, this changed, I think, during COVID. We saw for the first time that actually the tighten sanctions under Trump from late 2018, 2019 really started to kill Cubans. And we saw that with the COVID pandemic. So the Cubans, using their exceptional and in many aspects world-leading biotech sector, medical science sector, they were the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. But once they had the vaccine, they couldn't get hold of syringes to carry out a mass vaccination campaign. Why was that? Because the syringe companies, you know, syringes are cheap and mass produced, but the syringe factories had all been bought out by US corporations or US subsidiaries. And one element of US sanctions against Cuba is that any piece of equipment, any machinery, any good anywhere in the world, if it has 10% or more of its components are from a US company or a US subsidiary, then it can't be sold to Cuba. It doesn't matter if it's Turkish, Japanese, Indonesian, right? Unless they apply for a license, and the license is on a policy of refusal, right? So, you know, we saw people who the rollout of the mass vaccine was delayed. There was a huge upsurge in COVID. People died as a result of that. Also, they had one medical oxygen plant in Cuba, which was keeping people alive. That broke down. They couldn't get spare parts, and people died as a consequence, not just people with COVID, but anyone who needed it. And now what we're seeing is really, it's really exposed that this is a policy to enact genocide, to create that hunger desperation in order to try and achieve the overthrow of government, which is the ultimate objective. So, you know, if you deny a country access to fuel in this day and age, you know, the media has kind of focused on the fact of flights, right? They don't have the special fuel for flights, right? And that was the focus. But if you don't have fuel, you can't run, you know, you don't have electricity, because much of Cuba's electricity comes from hydrocarbons. You don't have electricity to keep hospitals running, to keep ICU, emergency care, running. You don't have fuel for transport. You don't have fuel for tractors to pick up the agricultural produce. You can't, you know, in Cuba they have incredible provision within communities. So they have the bodega, what they call them, it supplies local food for local communities. They have cultural centers, they have local doctors, local hospitals. But these all require the ability to transfer products and to transfer people. And all of this is affected. You know, if people can buy food, fresh food, they put it in a fridge to keep it fresh, then there's no electricity. These blackouts are going on, and it is really making life impossible. Lots of Cubans are now cooking with wood and with coal and so on, and you know, it's just totally unnecessary, right, on a political agenda to make Cubans suffer. Why? In order to make them turn against their own government. But they're supposed to do that. I mean, the US thinks that Cubans will ally themselves with the people who are causing this suffering. So in some ways, you know, it's really, I think it's true that many Cubans had got tired of hearing, you know, that there were shortages and prices were high and so on because of the blockade. They were like, yeah, we've had the blockade for 65 years, now it's 67. But, you know, really with this naval blockade, with the threat that any country that supplies oil to Cuba will face tariffs or possibly even face a military action, right? The hijacking of oil tankers, which has already happened in the high seas, complete piracy, completely illegal. You know, they are really clearly attempting to make life unsustainable on Cuba. I mean, you know, the Cubans are going to battle on. They're extremely resilient. I don't know if we'll go on and talk about this later, but the situation is very different from the sort of early 1990s when Cuba was receiving 90% of its oil imports from the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union collapsed overnight, and Cuba's oil imports went from 13 million tons in 1989 to sort of zero by 1992. And, you know, really, this is one of the things I looked at in my book, like how on earth did they survive? And how did they then go on to not just survive, but actually prosper and establish certain mechanisms of production or approaches that really are world leading in terms of organic agriculture, sustainable development, and so on. Today, the situation is different. About 50% of Cuba's electricity is produced domestically. So it has this very sulfurous, very heavy crude, but it can use that. It also has been working. They have a state plan. They have a political commitment to shift to renewable energies. This has been held up. They haven't advanced as far as they would have liked for the same reason, right? Because if you say, you know, technology can't enter Cuba if it has 10% origin from the United States, then of course that affects technology transfer. And a shift from, you know, when you're changing your energy matrix, it requires a technology transfer. But they are already in the midst of a project to set up 92 huge solar panel parks, which are being supplied with Chinese technology, Chinese solar panels. So, you know, this is not the same complete suffocation as in the early 1990s, but there are other restraints and restrictions, and the threat of violence is very present.
Indeed, Cuba has overcome the special period. The 90s is named as the special period, I think, and the severe economic crisis you described following the fall of the Soviet Union. And that energy revolution, that change is the socialist development model's reaction. Can we say that to counter the external threats to Cuba and Cuban people?
It is a reaction. Yeah, it is. But you know, the other question, one is necessity, right? They had no chemical fertilizers, so they had a necessity to shift to organic agriculture. But the other question is the capacity. Now, they had the capacity because they, you know, since the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, as a conscious policy, they have invested heavily in science and technology for social development. So if you look at the kind of spending that they've put in, the investments they've made, the number of scientists per population is extraordinarily high. It's, you know, almost the same as the imperialist countries. And that meant that when they had this crisis in the early 1990s, they were already experimenting with, you know, organic fertilizers and so on, and solar panels. The Cubans had the capacity. They were producing their own photovoltaics. In the 70s and 80s, they were working on this technology because they had cheap access, abundant access to cheap oil from the Soviet Union. They hadn't you know, they hadn't taken it as seriously as they might have, but they had the capacity. And this is what we're seeing again. You know, the Cubans have announced that every single polyclinic, these are like small local hospitals in Cuba, is having solar panels installed to deal with the current crisis. And these are the kind of collective and creative solutions that the Cubans will be resorting to now.
As you explained, historically, Cuba turned to the USSR and later Venezuela for its energy needs. Considering the current oil blockade, what role do emerging partners like China, you mentioned, play in Cuba's counter-blockade strategy?
So China is an interesting one because China is supplying Cuba with these solar panels for the solar panel parks, but that is a commercial agreement. They are not being donated. So we have to be clear on that. The Chinese have made some important and encouraging statements in the recent weeks, stating that they are opposed to the Trump measures and that they continue to stand in support of Cuba. But what we haven't seen is the kind of practical assistance that Cuba needs. Where are the oil tankers, you know? The similar thing, I guess, could be said about Russia, although the Russians, there is a lot of misinformation and a lot of misreporting, but it does appear that Putin has now said that Russia is going to supply Cuba with oil. It's going to send oil tankers. We haven't yet seen them arrive, so we're watching very closely to see whether that happens and how the United States react. But I will point out this: Cuba became earlier this year a full member of BRICS, which is, of course, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa alliance, which has increasingly endeavored to become a formal entity and a trade bloc and a political bloc to an extent, and has expanded its membership quite significantly. And Cuba is a full member. So, the question is, what is BRICS going to do now to defend one of its members against the weaponization of starvation? And let's be clear, we've just seen this. We've seen this as a policy that Israel used with full support from the United States against the Palestinian people and the people in Gaza. So, are the BRICS actually going to show that there is some purpose to their existence by defending one of their member states, which is Cuba, at this moment, and not allowing the Trump administration to essentially carry out another genocide against the Cuban people in this case?
And as we have seen in Gaza with the genocide in Gaza, it was the workers of the world, trade unionists, activists, civil society who gathered to break the siege, to break the blockade with flotillas. And now it's the same with Cuba. There is an international solidarity movement with Cuba and the Cuban people trying to raise awareness and to provide humanitarian aid. It takes different forms, declarations, petitions, but also demonstrations and a flotilla, like the Nuestra America flotilla. What are your observations and remarks on that international solidarity with Cuba and the Cuban people?
Well, in some ways, as has been said by others, this really is crunch time for Cuba. I can point out an obvious thing, which probably should be said. Cuba has shown extraordinary solidarity for the world, right? Proletarian internationalism. It has sent its soldiers to fight in defense for national liberation against apartheid South Africa. It sent 400,000 soldiers to fight with Angola to preserve its independence from the invading army of apartheid South Africa. And in the process, in that battle, won the independence of Angola and Namibia, which had been occupied for decades by South Africa. It supported national liberation struggles all around the world. It supported guerrilla struggles, particularly in Latin America. And beyond that, or in parallel to that, it also provided medical assistance to people. Almost every country in the world has received Cuban medical professionals. Most of them have provided treatment for people without Cuba receiving any payment. Since 2005, with the agreement with Venezuela under the presidency of Chavez, where it was the famous Oil for Doctors program, that is when Cuba started to receive payment for its medical services. Now, this is something Cuba has saved and improves the lives of millions of people around the world. It's also carried out literacy campaigns. It is responsible for bringing, the liberation of the ability to read and write to millions of people. They have, through Operation Milagro, Operation Miracle, that was set up with Venezuela, the two countries have been responsible for restoring the eyesight of something like 10 million people around the world. So, there is a Guatemalan researcher who's done some calculations, because, of course, when you talk about Cuba's internationalism, we tend to talk about it in terms of the sort of nostalgic notions of, the socialist internationalism and so on. But if we calculate the assistance that they've given to other countries, and we use the OECD methodology, right, where they calculate, the economic value of assistance provided. If we do that with Cuba, this Henry Morales, this Guatemalan researcher, has shown that between 1999 and 2015, Cuba contributed 6.6% of its GDP in overseas development aid. And that was something like between 4 and 5 billion every year, right? So if you look at the cost of the US blockade to Cuba on an annual basis in that period, it's about the same, which means, that probably Cuba could have doubled its overseas development aid if it hadn't been for the US blockade. But my point is that there are literally, this may seem like an exaggeration, but it's true, billions of people around the world who have received some assistance and solidarity from Cuba and Cubans, right? And that is the result of a conscious policy of an ideology of the Cuban Revolution, which was always fundamentally internationalist and anti-imperialist, and understood the importance of it understood the oppression of underdevelopment through imperialism, right? And it saw that poverty, malnutrition, the inability to read and write, the lack of access to education were consequences of the imperialist structure of the world, right? The division of the world into the oppressed and oppressor nations. And really now, when we think about it, if we allow Cuba to be toppled in the way proposed back in 1960 by Lester Mallory, and in the way now being driven under this ridiculously named Donroe Doctrine, driven by the nasty ambitiousness and hypocrisy of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, whose parents left Cuba, by the way, under the Batista dictatorship, but he allowed the false information to circulate that they were victims of Fidel Castro. If we allow them to achieve their objective of having the Cuban Revolution overthrown, not only will we lose the symbolism of Cuba, not only will we lose all of the areas in which Cuba has shown the way forward, that Cuba leads and inspires in terms of, the only country in the world to have a 100-year-long state plan to confront climate change, that is all about poor countries relying on their own natural and national resources. The only country to develop a lung cancer immunotherapy. The first country to have a meningitis B vaccine, to have a treatment for diabetic foot ulcers, which reduces the need for amputations by 70%. The first country to eliminate mother-to-child HIV AIDS transmission. All of these things will lose, but also on a really practical level, millions of people around the world who currently receive Cuban assistance will no longer receive it. So I think we have to be clear that we, and also as people on the left in the imperialist countries, not just the imperialist countries, sorry, I should say, globally, we cannot afford to let the Cuban revolutionary state be overthrown. We just cannot afford to, because it will make our whole job so much harder. To not have, such vibrant living example of what a revolutionary state can achieve. Within one generation, the Cubans had human development indicators equivalent to the richest countries in the world in terms of life expectancy, infant mortality, and so on and so forth. And, we need to know that another world is possible. And that's what we would lose if we allow the Cuban state to be overthrown, either through just this desperation and hunger which is the objective of their policy, or through a military action by the United States.
Professor, lastly, discussing the special period in your book, you talk about the revolutionary resilience of the Cuban people. With generational renewal, how did the revolutionary resilience of the Cuban people evolve?
How did it evolve? I mean, I think that, what people need to remember is that Cubans remember, there are enough Cubans alive, but also in terms of collective memory, they remember what it was like to have, I guess, what's called a capitalist democracy. They remember what Cuba was like as essentially a semi-colony of the United States. They remember the indignity, the abuses, the exploitation, the dominance by US interests. Interests which Marco Rubio is now representing, right? These are the people who want to destroy the revolutionary state in order to reclaim their wealth. So, you know, they in Cuban history, if you have to look at like the role of Jose Marti and the commitment to two key kind of, I guess, objectives, one being sovereignty and the other being social justice. And by understanding the role of the commitment to sovereignty and social justice, we can see the bridge that links Jose Marti and the struggle for independence first against the Spanish to the socialist revolution of 1959, right? Because at the heart of those is this struggle for sovereignty and social justice. In Cuba, because of, you know, imperialism and colonialism and imperialism, real sovereignty brings it into confrontation previously with colonialism, but today with imperialism. And that means, you know, that it cannot preserve that sovereignty really and truly under a capitalist system, because a capitalist system in Cuba will mean the return of imperialist interests, right? Because they will ally with the United States. The US economic power is too much that Cuba can sustain any sort of independent national capitalism. It's just not possible. So they've understood that, right? That the struggle for real independence in Cuba is the struggle for socialism. And that means social justice and sovereignty. And I think that, you know, as we were saying before, they've invested so much in science and technology, but also basic education, right? The Cuban people are extremely well educated. You will meet Cubans in the street who know more about your own history than you do, you know, and they have deep commitments to culture. They consider things like access to culture, art and sport a human right. So I think that really this is it. Actually, we must say that a key element of their resilience has been their capacity, despite hardships, to maintain unity. And I think, you know, clearly US policy has understood that to some extent. And that's why they have all these regime change programs. You know, the US Congress approves a budget. This is what's overtly approved, not to mention the money for covert operations, but it approves a budget of something like 20 billion every year for what they call democracy promotion. And of course, the Cubans quite rightly call regime change programs. And those are precisely targeting certain sectors and groups to break this unity between the Cuban people. And what you'll see in moments of crisis, the speeches by the revolutionary leaders, go and look at the speeches by Fidel Castro, then Raúl, and now Miguel Díaz-Canel. A central theme is we must remain united. We must maintain our unity. And that doesn't mean everyone has to say the same things or agree with the same things. There has always been a space within the revolutionary state for discussion, debate, and arguments. And actually, my first book on Che Guevara looked at something called the Great Debate in Cuba, which laid the foundations of that, of the need for, you know, a healthy critique and a healthy debate in order to improve policy. So I think those are really key things: commitment to sovereignty, to social justice, and understanding the importance of unity.
Thank you, Professor, for your insights. That covers all my questions for now. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I want to go back to, you mentioned the flotilla
Yes.
that's been organized. So this has now become a sort of global mobilization, not just from the Americas. And the idea is that people should, by land or sea or however they can, they should get to Cuba for a mass mobilization on the 21st of March. So I would just encourage your listeners, if they, you know, share the view that I have expressed, that we cannot afford to lose Cuba and that this is crunch point, and, you know, history will judge us on our reaction at this moment. I would encourage people, if they can, to take part, if they can't, to publicize, but also other actions that that whatever is in people's capacity, but we must work together. We must be collective. We must organize and pool our resources. We have to help Cuba to breathe. We have to help Cuba to keep the lights on, and whether that means shipping solar panels or the storage capacity or food and medicine, whatever it is. I know that there is a very strong sense of solidarity from within Turkey towards the Cubans, and I would just encourage people to make that concrete, make that actions, not words, right now, or actions and words, I should say.